The stage lights burned hot over the packed auditorium, casting long, dramatic shadows across the polished wooden floor. At center stage stood Arnold Schwarzenegger, 76 years old, yet still radiating the larger-than-life presence that had made him a global icon. His frame was as imposing as ever, his voice wrapped in that unmistakable Austrian cadence, each word slicing through the thick air like steel. More than 2,000 people filled every seat, hundreds more crammed into overflow rooms, eyes fixed on the podium. No one knew it yet, but the next 30 seconds would strip away the indestructible image of the Terminator and replace it with something rare: silence. Across from him sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, the Texas firebrand, whose rise had been nothing short of meteoric. At 42, she exuded a calm that felt dangerous, the kind that hides sharpened steel beneath silk. Her suit was immaculate, her gaze locked on Arnold with unblinking intensity. The subtle lift of her chin, the squared set of her shoulders, these were not the cues of someone here to politely trade talking points. This was the stance of someone who had come ready for battle. The event was billed as a conversation on the meaning of American success, a bridging of generations, a meeting of icons. Political chatter had been buzzing for weeks. Arnold's camp saw it as yet another victory lap, another chance to hold court with that legendary blend of charisma and grit, his immigrant success story once again taking center stage. What they hadn't counted on was an opponent who would not only refuse to be charmed, but would dismantle him in front of an audience, and the internet, in real time. "You think you can lecture us about America?" Arnold's voice boomed, his finger cutting the air like a blade as he pointed directly at her. "I built my success from nothing, and I see exactly what's wrong with this country." The moderator shifted uneasily. This wasn't on the program. The warm, bipartisan exchange had gone cold in minutes, and now the atmosphere felt more like a chess match played with loaded pistols. Jasmine didn't flinch. When she spoke, it was with the precision of a scalpel and the weight of someone who'd been rehearsing for this very strike her entire life. Her words would land with such force that within minutes, clips of the exchange would detonate across social media, shattering any illusion that this was a polite policy discussion. This wasn't a debate. This was about to become a defining moment. Phones began appearing in the audience like periscopes before a storm. They could feel it. History about to happen. Arnold believed he was staring down another politician who would bend under the heat of his fame and authority. He was wrong. This was a man who had made a life out of defying impossibilities. The bodybuilder told he'd never win. The actor told his accent would kill his career. The immigrant told he could never lead America's largest state. At 76, Arnold still moved with the certainty of a man who had never lost a fight worth winning. But certainty can become a blindfold. His recent jabs at younger politicians, accusing them of weakness, of living in a world of excuses, had already ignited backlash online. To Arnold, his story justified the criticism. He'd built an empire from dreams and discipline. He'd earned the right to speak without apology. But Jasmine Crockett was not a character in his script. She came armed with a very different kind of story, one rooted in systemic struggle rather than cinematic glory. Before Congress, she had been a civil rights attorney, unflinching in courtrooms where the stakes were measured not in applause, but in lives altered forever. She had fought battles no camera crew followed, in arenas where losing meant someone else's future crumbled. And that night, under the bright lights, she carried that same unshakable focus, a quiet, lethal readiness that didn't need to announce itself. The moment was coming when the crowd, the cameras, and even Arnold himself would realize this was no longer his stage. While Arnold had been scaling the glittering peaks of Hollywood and governing the sprawling empire of California, Jasmine Crockett had been wading into battles most Americans never saw. Courtrooms where the air was thick with tension. Legislative fights where every sentence carried consequences. She wasn't defending a brand. She was defending people. Her victories weren't measured in box office numbers, but in lives altered, rights preserved, and systems forced to reckon with their own injustice. Her preparation for this night wasn't casual. It was methodical, almost surgical. She'd dissected Arnold's career the way a trial lawyer studies a hostile witness, noting every strength, every polished anecdote, every habit of delivery. She had read his speeches, pored over his political record, and perhaps most dangerously for him, identified the places where his story left shadows, blind spots carved by privilege, gaps smoothed over by the narrative of triumph he'd repeated for decades. Arnold saw his journey as a universal blueprint for success. Jasmine saw it as a single thread in a much larger, more complex tapestry. She understood the invisible scaffolding that had held him steady, the obstacles he'd never had to dodge, the doors that had been closed to others, but quietly opened for him. And that was the true powder keg. This wasn't merely a conversation about the American dream. It was a collision between two very different versions of it. The immigrant who became a global icon, and the civil rights attorney turned Congresswoman who clawed her way into power by dismantling systems from the inside. The generational divide was almost as stark as the philosophical one. Arnold's America was a place where drive alone could conquer all. Jasmine's America knew that drive meant nothing if the playing field was tilted before you even stepped on it. The audience reflected that split in real time. On one side, older faces lit with admiration for Arnold, seeing in him proof that hard work and willpower could still move mountains. On the other, younger, more diverse faces leaned toward Jasmine, drawn to her refusal to sugarcoat the truth about opportunity in modern America. Between them sat a restless middle, undecided, searching, waiting to see which vision would claim them. The stakes were enormous. Political strategists, sensing the volatility of the moment, were already whispering to each other in the shadows. A single exchange here could ripple through cable news cycles, flood TikTok feeds, and harden or shift public opinion for years. Algorithms were waiting, teeth bared, ready to blast whatever came next into millions of screens before the echo of the words even faded. Arnold stepped into the silence like a man stepping into a familiar ring. The moderator's introduction had barely landed before Arnold gripped the podium with those famous hands, the knuckles pale under the lights. "Let me tell you something," he began, his accent thick and deliberate, each syllable sharpened from decades of practice. "I came to America with $7 in my pocket. $7. And I built an empire." The room murmured, some in admiration, others in quiet skepticism. He pressed on, his voice gathering force, not looking at the audience now, but locking onto Jasmine like a laser sight. "I didn't complain about the system. I didn't blame anyone for my problems. I worked harder than anyone else. I lifted weights when others slept. I studied English when others partied. I chased the American dream, and I caught it." Applause broke in scattered waves. Cameras tightened their focus, catching every flicker of expression. Jasmine didn't move, didn't smile, didn't blink. Arnold's rhythm quickened, fueled by the crowd's response. And now I look at Congress, and what do I see? People who've never built anything, never created jobs, never risked their own money, telling the rest of us how to live. It was a direct shot, aimed and fired without hesitation. The energy in the room thickened. You could almost hear the collective inhale. The moderator leaned back, eyes darting between them, sensing the moment slipping out of his control. Somewhere in the press row, a reporter mouthed two words to a colleague. "It's happening." The overhead lights carved harsh, angular shadows across their faces, turning the moment into something more primal than a policy discussion. Two fighters in the center ring, gloves off. "Congresswoman Crockett," Arnold said, his voice dropping into that cold, cinematic register audiences had heard in a dozen blockbuster showdowns. "With all due respect, what have you actually built? What businesses have you created? How many people have you employed?" The words hung in the air like a weighted glove, packed with decades of American mythology about hustle, entrepreneurship, and bootstrap grit. In the audience, bodies shifted forward instinctively, sensing blood in the water. This was the confrontation they had come to see. But now that it was here, the silence felt almost suffocating. Arnold stood loose but sure, the posture of a man who had asked this question before and seen it end the conversation every time. He knew his resume: an empire on film, a governorship over the fifth largest economy in the world, millions of jobs tied to his brand and projects. His slight smile suggested he believed the fight might already be over. Jasmine didn't rush. She didn't bristle. When she spoke, her voice was level. "Governor Schwarzenegger, I've built something you can't buy with all your Hollywood money." A pause, just long enough for the crowd to lean in. "Trust with the people I represent." Arnold laughed. A short, sharp sound without warmth. "Trust doesn't create jobs. Trust doesn't build hospitals. Trust doesn't fund schools. Results do that. And I've got the results to prove it." He rose to his full height, the shadow of his frame stretching long over the stage. The action hero was surfacing now, the man who had won on screen, and more often than not, in real life. "I was governor of the fifth largest economy in the world," he declared, voice booming. "I made tough calls. I balanced budgets. I didn't just tweet about problems. I solved them." Half the room erupted in cheers. The other half sat frozen, watching Jasmine as if waiting for her counterpunch. She didn't meet his volume with volume. Instead, she leaned in, voice low, but edged like a blade. "Governor, you're absolutely right about one thing. Results matter. So let's talk about results." A ripple of unease crossed Arnold's face, almost imperceptible, but it was there. "You governed during some of California's hardest years," she said. "You made tough decisions. But do you ever think about the people those decisions landed on?" Arnold's jaw flexed. "I made the calls that had to be made. Sometimes leadership means making unpopular choices." "Real leaders," Jasmine repeated softly, as if tasting the phrase. She looked directly at him. "Tell me, Governor, when you made those decisions, did you ever have to choose between paying for your child's medication or paying rent?" The question cracked through the air like lightning. The audience shifted, the energy tilting toward her. Arnold's eyes narrowed. "That's not the point. Did you ever work 3 jobs just to keep food on the table?" she pressed, her tone still calm but carrying the weight of lived experience. "Did you ever have to tell your kids they couldn't have shoes for school because the bills came first?" Arnold's confidence wavered, replaced with something taut and defensive. He tried to reset the ground. "I understand people struggle, but the answer isn't more government handouts. The answer is what I did. Work harder. Dream bigger. Never give up." The room went still, every breath held. Jasmine let the words hang there, unchallenged for a long beat, as if giving everyone in the auditorium time to feel the distance between his reality and hers. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but carried like a thunderclap in the silence. "Governor Schwarzenegger," she began, and there was a shift in her tone now, subtle but undeniable. The kind that makes even the most confident opponent feel the ground beneath them start to tilt. Arnold leaned forward slightly, straining to catch her next words. "I have a question for you." The room seemed to stop breathing. You could hear the low hum of the air vents, the quiet rustle of someone shifting in their seat, the faint click of a camera lens locking in focus. Arnold Schwarzenegger, the man who had stared down aliens, cyborgs, and political rivals, now stood motionless, waiting. Jasmine rose slowly, not to match his earlier show of physical dominance, but with the deliberate calm of someone holding the sharpest weapon in the room: the truth. Her voice, when it came, was steady and clear enough to reach every corner of the packed auditorium. "Governor, I respect your journey. Truly. Coming to America with $7 and building what you've built. That's remarkable." Arnold's shoulders eased just slightly. For a heartbeat, it felt as though the air might soften, that common ground might be found. But then her tone shifted. The gentleness remained, but a new edge slid beneath it. "I just want you to really think about your answer to this. When you came here with those $7, did you have to worry about being shot by police during a traffic stop because of the color of your skin?" The words hit with physical force. Gasps rippled through the audience. Arnold's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Jasmine didn't wait. "When you were chasing your bodybuilding dream, did casting directors tell you that you looked too threatening for leading roles? When you went into banks for loans, did they assume you were there to rob the place instead of invest in it?" Arnold's face paled under the stage lights. "And when your children went to school," she pressed on, "did you ever have to sit them down for the talk? Not about the birds and the bees, but about keeping their hands visible during a police stop so they'd make it home alive?" The crowd fractured, some on their feet in applause, some frozen in stunned silence, others shaking their heads, not in disagreement, but in dawning recognition. Jasmine lifted one hand, and the noise quieted like someone had thrown a switch. "You and I both believe in hard work, Governor. We both believe in the American dream. But we've been playing by entirely different rules. And it's time someone said that out loud." Arnold tried to cut in, his voice rasping. I never said everyone's journey was the same." "No," Jasmine interjected, her tone tightening. "You didn't say it. You implied it. Every time you act like success is just about working harder, without acknowledging the barriers people like me have to break through just to get in the room." She stepped closer to the mic, her words gaining heat without losing control. "You want to know what I've built, Governor? I've built a career in a justice system that wasn't built for people who look like me. I've built trust in communities that have been failed for generations. I've built bridges between worlds that you don't even know exist." Arnold's expression was shifting rapidly now. The confident governor, the commanding movie star, the business mogul. All of it seemed to dissolve, leaving a man suddenly adrift. And then she delivered the final blow. "Governor Schwarzenegger, you came to America and became the Terminator. But I was born into a world where I had to terminate the assumption that I didn't belong here." The silence that followed wasn't the kind that comes before applause. It was the kind that comes when people realize they've just seen something that will live far beyond this room. Arnold stood at the podium, the master of comebacks, suddenly unable to find one. His hands, once animated with certainty, now hung at his sides. The man famous for playing the unstoppable machine looked, in that moment, like someone who had just been powered down. The crowd's reaction was unlike anything seen in a political hall, some wiping away tears, others rising to their feet as if in reverence, all united in the knowledge they had witnessed a moment that would be replayed, quoted, and dissected for years to come. The auditorium shook with the sound of applause, thunderous, relentless, but broken in pockets by silence, so heavy it felt like gravity itself had deepened. Some people were on their feet, clapping so hard their palms would sting for days. Others sat frozen, unable to move, their minds struggling to keep up with what they had just witnessed. In the front row, a woman leaned toward her companion and whispered almost reverently, "I've never heard anyone explain it like that before." A middle-aged man beside her kept shaking his head, murmuring, "I never thought about it that way." But all of that, the clapping, the murmurs, the disbelief, was background noise to the most telling reaction in the room. Arnold Schwarzenegger, the man whose entire career had been built on never showing weakness, now stood still as stone, his face no longer the confident mask he wore so easily. The words Jasmine Crockett had just delivered weren't political jabs. They were precision strikes aimed at the foundation of his worldview, and they had landed. The confusion in his expression gave way to something else, something rarer: recognition. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't the booming, self-assured tone people expected. It was fragile, almost hesitant. I never meant to imply." The words faltered. He stopped, dragging a hand through his hair, the gesture making him seem older, suddenly human in a way no film role or campaign ever had. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said at last, his famous accent trembling around the edges. I think I need to think about what you just said." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't surrender. But for Arnold, who had made a life out of refusing to back down, it was perhaps the most unguarded thing he had ever said in public. What had just unfolded wasn't a political exchange. It was an unmasking. Two starkly different American realities had collided on stage, and one of them had been forced to confront the invisible weight carried by the other. Jasmine hadn't just made her point. She had broken through years of rehearsed defenses, laying bare the truth of unequal starting lines in a way that couldn't be brushed aside. The moderator, still visibly processing the moment, finally spoke. "I think we all need a moment to let that sink in." But the impact had already detonated. The Terminator had been terminated, not with spectacle or aggression, but with truth wielded like a scalpel. Within minutes, the exchange was everywhere. It didn't just trend, it swallowed the internet whole. On social media, hashtags erupted. Terminator, terminated. Jasmine knockout. Different rules, millions of posts flooding in within an hour. The freeze frame of Arnold's face in the instant Jasmine delivered her final line became a meme overnight. Not the cheap, mocking kind, but something deeper. An image capturing the exact moment privilege met perspective and didn't know how to respond. GIFs spread like wildfire, Arnold's confident grin collapsing into stunned silence. Clips of his rousing, boastful opening statements, juxtaposed with his speechless reaction, racked up millions of views before the night was over. Comment sections overflowed with personal stories, people describing moments when they, too, had been told they were just not trying hard enough, while facing obstacles invisible to those giving the advice. This was bigger than politics now. It had become a national reckoning about opportunity, privilege, and the quiet architecture of systemic barriers. Global media picked up the story. European outlets fixated on Arnold's immigrant background and how his American dream narrative had been reshaped. Asian networks highlighted the cultural and generational divide. African broadcasters echoed Jasmine's unflinching points about systemic inequality. Major U.S. networks scrambled to cover it, but struggled with the framing. This wasn't a scandal, a lie, exposed, or a gotcha moment. It was something far more dangerous to the status quo, an undeniable shift in perspective. Progressive voices hailed Jasmine as the first to translate systemic injustice into terms even its skeptics couldn't dismiss. Conservative commentators stumbled over their responses. Criticizing Arnold risked alienating their base. Defending him now rang hollow. One veteran political analyst summed it up. In 30 years of covering politics, I've never seen anything like this. It wasn't about outmaneuvering an opponent. It was about lived experience colliding with assumptions, and for once, the assumptions lost. Behind the scenes, Arnold's team scrambled. How do you spin a moment when your client wasn't just beaten in a debate, but visibly shaken at his core? How do you patch over a moment when the world saw not the legend, but the man, unsure, unprepared, and changed? Early attempts to downplay the exchange fell flat. The narrative had already escaped their control. The applause hit like a rolling thunderstorm, unrelenting, electric. Some in the audience rose to their feet, clapping with an almost feverish energy. Others sat frozen, wide-eyed, as though they'd just watched a magician reveal the trick that had fooled them their whole lives. In the front row, a woman leaned toward her companion and whispered, almost reverently, "I've never heard anyone explain it like that before." A few seats away, a middle-aged man shook his head slowly, murmuring, "I never thought about it that way." But the most telling reaction came from Arnold himself. At first his expression was tight, unreadable. Then, like the slow turn of a tide, something shifted. Confusion gave way to recognition. Not the comfortable kind that comes from understanding, but the unsettling awareness that the ground beneath you isn't as solid as you thought. When he finally spoke, his voice was stripped of its usual bravado, barely more than a whisper. "That's not... I never meant to imply." The words stalled. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture making him look older, smaller somehow, than he had at the evening's start. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said at last, his famous accent now tinged with strain. I think I need to think about what you just said." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't surrender. But for a man whose entire public persona was built on never backing down, it was perhaps the most honest thing he had ever said in front of a crowd. What had unfolded wasn't just a political exchange. It was the collision of two vastly different American realities. Privilege had been forced to meet perspective. Success, in that moment, had been redefined. Jasmine had done what countless voices had tried and failed to do. She had distilled the concept of systemic barriers into something undeniable, even to someone who had lived his life believing they didn't exist. The moderator, silent until now, finally exhaled and said quietly, "I think we all need a moment to process this." But the processing had already begun. Arnold Schwarzenegger, the Terminator, had been undone, not by weapons, not by force, but by a truth delivered with the precision of a scalpel by a woman who had spent her life fighting battles he had never seen. Within minutes, the clip was everywhere. It didn't just trend, it detonated across every platform. Hashtags like "Cured Terminator," "Terminated," "Jasmine Knockout," and "Different Rules" flooded feeds worldwide. The image of Arnold's face as Jasmine delivered her final line, stunned, hollowed of certainty, became an instant meme. But unlike the usual political memes designed to mock, this one carried weight. It was the moment privilege met perspective and didn't have an answer. GIF creators pounced, looping the instant his confident demeanor dissolved into silence. Side-by-side videos, showing his bold opening lines against his stunned reaction, racked up millions of views within hours. In comment sections, people poured out personal stories of invisible hurdles and quiet struggles, the kinds that success stories like Arnold's rarely accounted for. The conversation had cracked something open. It was no longer about political points. It was about the architecture of opportunity itself. News outlets scrambled. European channels dissected the cultural implications for an Austrian-born American icon. Asian networks highlighted generational divides. African media amplified Jasmine's dismantling of systemic myths. The confrontation became a global touchpoint for the conversation about privilege, merit, and the elusive American dream. Political strategists were left reeling. Progressives hailed Jasmine as a communicator who could bridge divides without condescension. Conservatives faced an awkward impasse, unable to attack Arnold without undermining their own narratives, but equally unable to defend a worldview now publicly shown to be incomplete. Behind the scenes, Arnold's team went into quiet crisis mode. How do you spin a moment when your client wasn't just out-argued, but visibly altered? Initial attempts to downplay it only deepened the impact. A brief statement about continuing the conversation was met with online ridicule. People knew authenticity when they saw it, and they had just seen it in Jasmine, not in the press release. For days, Arnold stayed silent, and in that silence, the moment only grew larger. They had challenged each other's ideas without crossing the line into personal destruction, and in doing so, they had set a new standard. The aftershocks of that single evening rippled outward in ways neither could have predicted. Teenagers who had never watched a debate in their lives started following Jasmine's speeches and interviews, dissecting her delivery the way others analyze sports highlights. Veteran lawmakers began quietly studying her cadence, her precision, her ability to dismantle an argument without dismantling a person. Even foreign commentators marveled at how she had navigated the minefield of race, inequality, and opportunity, transforming it from a wedge into a bridge. Arnold's own transformation became an equally compelling subplot. The man who once strode onto stages as an immovable force now emerged as an unlikely messenger for self-reflection. His journey from confident challenger to silent listener to earnest learner became a living parable about growth, that it's never too late to reconsider what you thought you knew. The confrontation left behind a blueprint for something greater than politics. It proved that the most effective way to discuss hard truths isn't through shouting or shaming. It's through precision, empathy, and the courage to meet people where they are. It showed that lived experience can pierce through walls that statistics can't reach. And it reminded a divided nation that it is possible to challenge another's worldview while still respecting their humanity. By the time the lights dimmed that night, Arnold Schwarzenegger, the unstoppable Terminator, had walked off stage no longer as the conqueror, but as the student. Jasmine Crockett, who had arrived as a promising political figure, left as something far more. A voice capable of threading the needle between division and understanding, justice and unity. And the image that endured was not a raised voice or a pointed finger. It was Arnold, frozen mid-thought, as if a new understanding had just landed and was rearranging the furniture of his mind. That still frame became a symbol of something rare in public life, the moment a person truly hears. It was a reminder that the American story is not a single narrative, but a vast, uneven landscape of experiences, and that real leadership requires the humility to listen, learn, and grow. The next time two voices meet on a stage like that, it might not just be a debate. It could be another moment that changes the conversation for an entire nation. And if it's anything like this one,